And the idea that I like to get across to students is that the finger is not actually playing the note. The finger is just the way that the arm and therefore the body is in contact with the bass. So what happens is that the weight of the arm and the gravity of the body comes through the string via the hand. Okay, so when you teach a string student to use the bow, you always talk about not pushing or forcing the bow into the string, but letting the weight of the bow help you produce the tone. It's the same thing with right hand pizzicato technique. So the fingers are where the contact comes, but the weight of the arm is what plays the note. So you can have a bassist get this idea simply by hooking this index finger on the E string and letting the weight of the arm drop like this. We're not using any action with the index finger. The finger is not doing something, but the arm is just dropping the weight like this, okay? There's not effort involved in playing the note. You just let the note happen. It's easier to say that to a young student than it is for them to feel that, but eventually they will come to feel that. So this is what happens on each of the strings. You can see that I'm letting my arm just drop. And that's kind of the ideal for tone production. Now, I have as much of this index finger on the string as I can. One of the ways I like to tell students to visualize the right hand is that the fingerboard, the finger that is plucking the string, is on the fingerboard before it pulls the string, and it's on the fingerboard after it pulls the string. So it's almost like the finger never leaves contact with the fingerboard. It pulls, and the string has to somehow slip through it, and that's the attack. The finger is in there the whole time. And that's a very different sound than a surface attack on the string with the finger. So this is a surface attack with the fingertip, which is unpleasant to my ears. And then this is the sound of the finger being on the board the whole time. So as much contact with the string with the fingerboard as possible. How I like to think about it. The left hand plays a very big role in tone production as well. Okay, if you have a bass player who's practicing dropping the weight of their arm and getting this big sound, that's great. There's this ebony nut right here which the string is attached to, and it's providing a very solid anchor for the other side of that. Now, as soon as the finger comes in and stops a note, all of a sudden there's another element there of variables. So the left hand has to be as strong as this tension over this nut in order for the tone to remain consistent, okay? Now, bass guitarists will use all four fingers when they play. But on double bass, there are a couple hundred years of pedagogical tradition which have taught us to use just three fingers. The first finger, second finger, and the fourth finger. These two are kind of one unit. More and more players these days are using four fingers once they get into a certain position. That's fine. But down in the lower positions and for purposes of intonation, it's really nice to use what is called the Simandl hand positions. Okay, those come from Franz Simandl's method for double bass from the mid-19th century. So you have a half step between the first finger and the second finger, and you have a half step between the second finger and the fourth finger. And the fourth finger and third finger are a unit that go together, right? I really recommend some familiarity with Simandl just for the purposes of strength and intonation, because you have a hand position which spans one whole step, and as you move up the board, that hand position stays the same. You always know what a whole step's going to be. It stays the same while shrinking down a little bit because of the physics of the string. The whole step becomes smaller. But you always know what your half steps are. You always know that if you're here with your first finger, you've got a fourth below it, minor seventh below it, minor 10th below it, major third, major sixth, minor third, minor sixth. So this is the hand position that allows a bass player with this huge expanse of ebony to be reading a chart and actually have some hope of playing any of the notes correctly while not looking at the fingerboard. So I recommend it strongly. But the point, the reason I mentioned this is because the left hand contributes to the pizzicato tone when you're playing jazz by first being strong, like a nut, strong and holding down the string while you plug it. The second thing that happens is that the left hand sustains every note. Now it's not so much controversial as it is an issue that has seen some evolution over the course of jazz's history. But this is what Ray Brown says, and my teacher, and lots of other people, so I'm going to pass it on to you. In jazz, the notes are always long when you're walking a bass line. They're not short. A note doesn't end until after the next note has begun, which is not really physically possible, but that's what we go for, okay? So when you play blues, you're playing legato through every single note. You're not playing when we switched from gut strings to steel strings, we began connecting all of the notes. So even when you're playing, even then you're connecting everything. It's that this is not connected, and that's not the idea. But it's almost as if, and your bass players, you can have them practice this. They won't enjoy it, but if they were walking a bass line and they were playing it like this, so I'm just playing legato and connecting the whole bass line. Doesn't that sound cool? Wouldn't you like to have that on a gig, Rachel? Yeah. That is the idea. That is the way that the notes are connected. And as I said, many people have mentioned this before. There is a wonderful Ray Brown masterclass that is available on YouTube, of course. If you go to YouTube and look for Ray Brown and BBC masterclass, there's a class that he did at the Guildhall in the 70s where he talks about, you know, in the old days, this is how you play jazz, like this. And if you see videos of Oscar Pettiford, you know, struggling to be heard in a club, this is what he's doing. And then Ray says, and then we got to steel strings, and now we connect our notes like this, and this is how it goes. So it's hard for the young bassist to understand when they are here behind the bass how it is that that connection of notes in the left hand is actually the thing that makes the sound at the back of the room be what it is that you imagine a bass sounds like in jazz. Because you can be up here and think, oh, no, a bass goes boom, 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 so I'm going to play boom, boom. But really, you know, if you go to the back of the hall, up here, this is what you hear. And at the back of the hall, you hear that Paul Chambers sound that we think of as a bass. So that's, you have to kind of ask them to just trust you on this one. So that affects the quality of the tone. It affects the perception of intonation and how the student's able to adjust that. It affects what comes out of the pickup. So these two, the left hand and this right hand idea are both very important when it comes to that. Here is the crash course. This is what I always tell students. Okay, you're playing bass. The most important thing that you can do when you're playing certain types of straight ahead jazz is to play the root of the chord when it occurs. That sounds simple, right? But when the chord changes, play the root at that moment. Down the line, you can start not doing that. So if that's what I want to work on, I'll take something like the circle of fourths, as I've got an example one here, and I'm just going to go around and play chord roots and just get used to just playing, you know, with a metronome, just playing the root of a chord. The next thing you're going to say is, well, if you're going to play the root of the chord when it occurs, play something right before that root that approaches it sensibly. So there's an approach tone to the root. So to practice that, take 4 approaches. A whole step above, a whole step below, a half step above or a half step below, and practice the same thing, circle of fourths or any other combination that you like to use to go through 12 keys. For example, I like to break the 12 keys up into 3 diminished 7th chords or into 4 augmented chords, and so I'll play around, you know, C to E to G sharp to A to C sharp to F. I can tell you more about that in a minute. But so what I'll do here in example 2A is I'm approaching the roots from a whole step above. So B flat is the root, E flat is the root, A flat is the root, D flat is the root, G flat is the root. What I've done on your example here is to put the approach tones in parentheses so that you can see what that is. Okay. Example 2B, now I'm going to approach those roots from a half step below. They don't have to snap. This is a metronome, ideally. I'm just doing this for. So that works. A half step below or above works in almost any situation, although too many half steps above can sound irritating after a while. If you want to approach from a whole step below, you can do that, and I've indicated that the chords are probably minor chords in that case. This is example 2C, so I would go through. You can tell that maybe not, maybe it's just to my ears. This is not as strong of an approach as some of the others. But it depends. If you're playing quarters, it's a different story. So just practice those around, and you can also approach from a fifth above or from a fourth below. And if you do that around the circle, it's kind of not that interesting. But then you realize, oh, that's, you know, the fifth above the next chord is the one that I'm playing right now. So if you look at example 3A, here's another thing I like to think of, and this is if your students can come to the understanding of what the harmonies are that go with the chords, which is really the first thing. What scale goes with that chord? What is the arpeggio of that chord? Then they've made huge progress and can go on with this. The next thing I like to do is to think about how an approach tone functions as in its relation to the chord that it's approaching, but also to the one that it's coming from. So in the examples that I already showed there, you can see that, you know, if I approach a chord, if I'm going around through a fourth cycle and I'm approaching a chord from a whole step above, that note is also in the key that I'm already in. That's the fifth of that key. So I'm going C, G to F. I'm thinking of the G as a whole step above F, but I'm also thinking of it as the fifth of C. So then this is kind of where the magic starts happening in bass lines. Approach notes, approaches start to become conceived of in relation to where you already are as well as to where you're going. So in example 3A, if I'm just going to play triads, major triads, to approach the next chord in the cycle, I'm going 1, 3, 5, 3, 1, 3, 5, 3, 1, 3, 5, 3. So the approach note is a half step below my new root, but it's also the third of the chord I'm already on. So that's a pretty boring bass line if you play it forever, but it's a great exercise, especially because it makes your students come to understand where these triads are, whether you start on the root and go up or whether you go down to the third, you know. Example 3A contains actually 3 different things. The next one, if you look to the B flat 7 to E flat 7 chord, this is now starting to come actually more from jazz language as you see it in the playing of people like Ray Brown and Paul Chambers. A triad descending chromatically to the next root. So you've got an on-chord tone. It's not related at all to the, well, it's related in some way, but it's not part of the chord you're coming from. It's a chromatic resolution to the next one. Okay? If you look at transcriptions of Paul Chambers, and Jim Stennett has done several books of these, and of Sam Jones as well, you'll see this idea of the root of a chord, the root of the next chord, and the player goes from this root to one side of the upcoming root, back to the other side of that root, and then approaches it and gets there. So it's like walking bass is full of these encirclements of roots, okay? So that's another thing to think of. Now, if you listen to Slam Stewart playing in 1941, you'll hear a lot of purely triadic bass lines like you see in 3A. But if you look at 3B, moving into scalar ideas is probably the next step for your students. And they should be kind of understanding the scales anyway. But if you are going from, say, C major to F major and you descend, and you descend, you can do it just by playing the scale. You could descend from F to B flat, from B flat to E flat. It's all part of the scale. If you wanted to ascend to the next root, you wouldn't be able to do it just in the scale because there aren't enough notes. So stick a different note in there. Think about a major bebop scale, or where a chromatic half step is included between two scale tones to make the line even out. So what I've done there, you can see if C major goes down to F, F goes up to B flat, and then I did a little encirclement here. But that idea is helpful if transposed to every key and worked on. If you look at what is there in the A flat minor 7 to D flat 7 flat 9, for minor chords, you can go up and use a non-chord tone on the major third. So A flat minor, minor third, major third approaches the next root, which is D flat, and then D flat descends to where it's headed. D flat 7 flat 9 goes to G flat minor. So practicing just walking in scales can be very helpful. However, it will almost immediately start sounding, well, it can start to sound a little bit bland, so it's best if mixed in with other things. The one thing I want to leave you with is kind of like where this all comes to. Example 4, alternating chord tones and non-chord tones on odd and even beats, okay? This is not a rule that has to be followed all the time. Of course, no rules do. And it would be very difficult to do so. But this is something that Cecil McBee pointed out to me a long time ago. If you think about beats 1 and beat 3 of the bar and 4/4s being the strong harmonic beats, the beats where the harmonic information happens. So if you've got 2 chords in a bar, the change will probably be, you know, 1 on beat 1, 1 on beat 3. Think of beats 2 and 4 as being weak harmonic beats, but strong rhythmic beats. That's when the hi-hat goes. Okay, so a bass player does not make distinctions between these beats in the accents of the notes. So we don't play, we play doom, 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 doom. But what we do is a lot of times think about placing harmonic information on 1 and 3, the strong harmonic beats, and placing non-chord tones on beats 2 and 4. So that kind of makes a bass line that has forward motion in it, and it will always be moving forward because it's going home, away, home, away, home, away, home, away, home, away. So if you look at example 4, the parenthetical notes are non-chord tones. This is a C major 6 chord, so C, chord tone, non-chord tone, chord, non-chord, non-chord, non-chord. A is the 6th of the major chord. And then you can always put any triads in there. So, was that a familiar collection of pitches? What was that? It was a major bebop scale, right, which is, of course, a synthetic scale. It's my friend who wants to have lunch after the clinic, telling me that the clinic's over now. The bebop scale is constructed to do just that, to place the chord tones on the strong beats. and the non-chord tones on the weak beats, but of course usually we hear it as something that happens in eighth notes. But for a bass player to work on doing this, it will be very helpful to do it on major, just a major like tonality, like here's a major chord, walk on it, or here's a minor chord, play in D minor, chord, non-chord, 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 chord, chord. I got off of it right there because there's another lick there, but that is a way of kind of coming to understand what a bass line does. It's not just a collection of quarter notes being thrown out into the world that have some relation to the key. It is a way of stating harmony, but also propelling it into the next place. And within a line, and this will be the last thing I say, within a line, a bass player will make little harmonic changes evident as well. Like if we play this in D minor, you're on the root at the beginning of the first bar, the 5 at the beginning of the second bar, the root at this bar, the 5 here. So even within a line on one chord, you make this kind of rocking harmonic motion that if you just play this, well, I'm playing roots a lot. Doesn't that sound like a cool bass line? It's too many roots, right? It's not going anywhere. It's just staying at home all the time. So the bass line has to kind of show tension and release and a little journey on its own, thinking in terms of one beat to the next beat, in terms of a 2-bar phrase, in terms of an 8-bar phrase. If you're playing So What, you've got 16 bars of D minor, so you have a whole open landscape to kind of go on a little journey just with D minor. Okay.